Hi, welcome to Album Soup, where I talk about the different ingredients, influences, and styles that go into a particular album and make it such a special and delicious piece of art. In this particular episode, we're going to be talking about In the Airplane Over the Sea by Neutral Milk Hotel. This album is a cult classic, and I have nothing to say about it. That's not because there aren't things to be said, but because so much has already been said by other people, and I don't think I have anything more to add to that. That being said, what we will talk about are the influences that went into this album, which is something that I think isn't discussed enough. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the first category or genre of music that I think influenced this album, lo-fi indie rock. Airplane is a really difficult album to categorize, but at its heart, I do think it's an indie rock album. And it's a very 90s album at that. So my first recommendation is kind of the cornerstone, one of the most important 90s indie rock albums ever, which is Pavement Slanted and Enchanted. This is also super lo-fi. It was recorded at a home studio, and yet it's still so catchy, it's still so melodic, it's still so fun. I can't recommend this one enough. No surprise that it influenced Mangum as well as every other indie band of that era and every era since then. My next two albums are not interchangeable, but I don't have different thoughts about them. What I would say about one is what I would say about the other, so I'm going to combine them. That's Sebado with 3 and Guided by Voices with B1000. These are other indie rock albums from the 90s, specifically ones that Mangum said he really liked. I certainly like both of them, even if I don't like them as much as Slanted and Enchanted, but I definitely think they're worth listening to if you want to kind of understand lo-fi recording styles of that era, as well as indie rock songwriting and sounds and everything. My last band is one that I hadn't heard of before doing this research, but certainly deserves more attention. This is Tall Dwarfs with their album Hello Cruel World. Hello Cruel World isn't actually an LP, it was 4 EPs put together. And this band was just so creative. They brought a real whimsical energy to indie rock and lo-fi indie rock at the time. They invented their own percussion as well. Mangum really said that they were one of his favorite bands, and it's easy to see why. Next up, we're going to talk about some of the psychedelic influences on Airplane. If you're familiar with Airplane and you're familiar with how psychedelic music can sound, I don't think this is such a big stretch. First up, we're talking about Syd Barrett with the Mad Cat Laughs. Syd was the founder of Pink Floyd. He was only around for the really early stuff like Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And this is his first and kind of only solo record. It's weird, it's surreal, it's clearly an influence on Airplane, although you might not love it. I will admit that it's growing on me, though I didn't love it at first, but it's definitely worth listening to hear the psychedelic influences on Airplane. Next up, we have Soft Machine with their self-titled album. These guys are not so conventionally psychedelic, and that's a ridiculous thing to say, I know. They're more closely aligned with Canterbury Prog, but in that they bring a lot of that whimsical 60s energy to their music. They fuse with their prog some jazz and some sound collage and music concrete stuff. So they're weird and experimental and definitely worth checking out, even if they're Canterbury Prog albums I prefer. And last up, for this era and this sound, I have Tim Buckley with Goodbye and Hello. I don't have any kind of evidence that Jeff Mangum and Neutral Milk Hotel were specifically influenced by Tim Buckley, but man, I love this album. I think it's really whimsical. It has some of that circus music energy that Neutral Milk Hotel really liked as well. Not to mention some of the psychedelic stuff, not to mention really emotive singing. Tim's got a really unique voice and he yelps, and I just love it. And I definitely think you should check this out if you're looking for more of that stuff. Next up, I want to talk about a couple of singer-songwriter albums. It definitely is not fair to call Airplane a singer-songwriter album because it was made by a band, Neutral Milk Hotel. But given that Jeff Mangum was in the driver's seat so much with his singing and songwriting, I do think this is a relevant thing to talk about what influenced him as a singer and songwriter. And so first up, I have Vic Chestnut with Is the Actor Happy? Vic was a member of the Athens, Georgia scene that was so big in the 90s that the Neutral Milk Hotel band members actually moved there to be part of it and be closer to it. Vic's singing and songwriting is really emotive, really powerful stuff. It's certainly not experimental or weird like most of the other things I'm talking about here, but it's definitely worth checking out. The other singer-songwriter album I have, though, is probably the weirdest thing I'm going to talk about today, and that's Daniel Johnston's Hi, How Are You? This album, which is one of the most famous Outsider albums ever, is super lo-fi, super unique, very emotive. I struggle to get into it, but I'm glad I've listened to it, and I think you should too. It has moved a lot of your favorite artists over the years. The next genre I have to discuss is folk. And when I say folk, I'm not talking about Bob Dylan or American folk. I think that's a really limited way to think about folk music. Instead, I'm actually talking about the Balkan folk that influenced Airplane. The Balkan region of Eastern Europe has, like every part of Earth, a unique indigenous musical heritage, and a lot of that stuff, especially their brass stuff, is really prominent and beautiful on in the Airplane Over the Sea, especially tracks like The Fool. And as a brass fan myself, this was one of the most fun things to get into. My first recommendation is Orange Twin Fieldworks Volume 1. I don't know if any other volume exists, but Volume 1 is great. It's actually made by Jeff Mangum of Neutral Milk Hotel. He took a sound recording of a folk festival in Bulgaria. So I guess you can really see the kind of music that was moving him and influencing him when he made Airplane, the folk stuff, right? I really think this stuff is as eerily haunting as it is beautiful, and I'd recommend it to people who like natural snow buildings. And by the way, I really think natural snow buildings have to have gotten their name inspired by Neutral Milk Hotel. It's just too much of a similarity for that to be a coincidence. The next thing I have to recommend in the folk genre would be A Hawk and a Hacksaw, which is actually a side project or a post-Neutral Milk Hotel band formed by their drummer, Jeremy Barnes. My only complaint about this group is that their music is so difficult to find online, not just streaming, but even for purchase. I would buy it, so if you somehow are seeing this, Jeremy Barnes, make it more available. They really go a lot deeper into the folk stuff, and I really recommend their music if you're willing to put in the work to kind of find it on YouTube, like songs or whatever. My last recommendation for folk is actually not a band that influenced Airplane because it came after, but it was influenced by Airplane. This is Beirut with Gulag Orchestra. Beirut really dives way deeper into the brass elements of Balkan folk, very clearly influenced by Airplane, but still very much its own thing. I love Beirut. They're one of my favorite folk bands ever, and this album, their debut album, is the most indebted to that Balkan brass sound and style. And so I really recommend it if you like tracks like The Fool or the other brass moments on Airplane. Next up, I have to talk about the collaborators of Neutral Milk Hotel. They're often seen in a vacuum, but that's not accurate in the slightest. The band members were actually part of a collective called Elephant Six, which had been founded in high school by four original members, Jeff Mangum and Airplane's producer Rob Schneider among them. This collective, in a nutshell, brought together their love of 90s indie rock with psychedelic pop from the 60s, like Beach Boys and everything the Beach Boys influenced. And so I want to talk about some of their albums, because if you understand Airplane, you have to kind of grasp the other Elephant Six albums that came out around the same time. First up is Rob Schneider's band, Apples in Stereo, with the album Her Wallpaper Reverie. This kind of reminds me of Sgt. Pepper's era Beatles. It's certainly the most weird and interesting the band Apples in Stereo had gotten up until that point. Very forward thinking. Clearly you can see how that and Airplane were part of the same broad ecosystem of music. Next up, I have Olivia Tremor with Dusk at Cubist Castle. I love this album. It's a lot more pop, with the psychedelic pop elements being really pronounced. I think at its most pop, it could have gotten radio play, as a matter of fact, and yet it's well over an hour, and there's a lot of sound collage and other experimentation going on. So I think it brings together the best of both of those things, and I can't recommend this one enough. Next up is a band called the Gerbils with Are You Sleepy? Not one of the most well-known Elephant Six acts, but clearly one that Neutral Milk Hotel is aligned with. Band members Scott Spillane and Jeremy Barnes were part of this group. Mangum was clearly a big fan of it. Neutral Milk Hotel covered some of their tracks. This is really soft and sweet sounding. It's not as huge or ambitious as something like Dusk at Cubist Castle, but I still think it's really nice listen. And my last Elephant Six recommendation is by the Music Tapes, which was the band of Julian Coster of Neutral Milk Hotel after Neutral Milk Hotel kind of ceased making music. The album is First Imaginary Symphony for Nomad, and this is the closest I think Airplane might have to a sequel, a spiritual sequel, because it's also about a dead person that the creator of the album was really drawn to or enchanted by. I'm not going to get into the lore because that's not what this is about. This album is way less pop than Airplane, though. It goes way deeper into the music, concrete, and experimental stuff. It's certainly not as easy to grasp, but I definitely think it's worth checking out. There are just two albums that I want to talk about now. Didn't really fit into the other categories, but I really think are worth checking out if you want to really understand Airplane. The first is Minutemen, Double Nickels on the Dime. These guys were a punk group from the 80s. Jeff Mangum kind of said that they inspired him to make a band. They were just really important in his musical maturity. And man, this album is a double album that really expanded what punk could sound like. It's just totally worth listening to, totally worth checking out to see how it influenced rock going forward. The other album I want to talk about is The Microphones with the Glow Part 2. This album is compared to Airplane quite a lot, probably the most common comparison I see to Airplane, and it makes a lot of sense why. It's very tender, it's gentle folk with some noise and some lo-fi stuff and some horns. I don't necessarily feel the same way about this album as I do about Airplane. They're still distinctive pieces of art, but if you like one, you're almost certainly going to like the other. And unlike Neutral Milk Hotel, Phil Elverum, the artist behind The Microphones and Mount Eerie, has a big discography. So if you like this, you have a lot more to check out. That's all the recommendations I have. Thanks so much for listening to me yap about In Aeroplane Over the Sea. I want to end with a quote from Jeff Mangum that kind of expresses the philosophy of this channel too. He says, "My moral philosophy and my personal philosophy are things that I understand without knowing. And I'm sometimes amazed when I read interviews with people who know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it and what they're doing it for." I really think that music, like all art and all of our thoughts really, are a mishmash of our influences and things that we can't really pinpoint. I'm sure that Jeff Mangum listened to so much more music than the stuff that I've just said. I'm sure that he's a fan of so much more other stuff. And the albums that I've listed today are simply some of the core things that I really think shaped Airplane. But like any great art, it's a soup, a mishmash of lots of different ideas.